All right, so we are going to go ahead and get started for this afternoon's meeting. My name is Mikkel Adgate. I work in DEP's Bureau of Public Affairs and Communications. I'm very excited to have all of you with us this afternoon for this informational briefing on our unified stormwater rule. We have several panelists this afternoon who are going to be speaking from our Bureau of Environmental Planning and Analysis and our Bureau of Water and Sewer Operations to talk us through the unified stormwater rule, including the regulatory context, basically what's brought us all here this afternoon. We're going to talk through what's changing for those of you who have applied for permits with us, stormwater permits with us in the past. You'll learn about what's changing as we're going into 2022. We'll also talk you through our new New York City Stormwater Manual, which is a guidance document that's going to be really helpful and informative for folks who are applying for permits with us. And then at the end, we'll go through next steps so that we can orient ourselves in terms of what to anticipate going into 2022. In terms of questions today, we are in a webinar format because we do have such a large audience, and we're thankful that there's so much interest in learning about the new rule. So if you have questions, we're going to encourage you to type them into the chat so that we can record them and add them into our frequently asked questions that'll be available on our website. We'll doing that so that we have an opportunity to respond to all of the questions that come in and put them in a visible place on the DEP website so that everyone can benefit from the responses. So we really encourage you to make use of the chat function and to take questions as we go along. And with that, we'll kick it off to our first presenter, who is Pinar Balsi, the Assistant Commissioner from the Bureau of Environmental Planning and Analysis, to talk us through that regulatory context. So thanks, Pinar.
All right, thank you for the great introduction, Mikkel. And we have a lot of great information today, which we hope to walk you through in a simple and high-level context. But we also want to really take our time to share enough details so everybody can understand what this new rule is about and how it's really going to affect the community and the development community as a whole. So before we go to the technical details, what I would like to do today is to set the stage where we are here today. Is most of you are very familiar with what's currently going on in the regulatory climate when it comes to stormwater management. We have the chapter 19.1, which is indeed currently overseen by our group. Peck O'Connor is our engineer who is approving these construction permits in the city. The current 19.1, chapter 19.1, which focuses on the water quality requirements, only applies to the separately sewered areas of the city, which is around 40%. And we do have a stormwater design manual, which is on our website, and a lot of the designers do follow when the project indeed triggers or disturbs the soil 1 acre and more in the separately sewered areas of the city. Most of the southeastern Queens, some parts of Brooklyn and Staten Island falls in that bucket. So the designers need to follow this design manual, and the requirement is to manage the volume of 1.5-inch rainfall event. Under the chapter 31, which is in our Bureau of Water and Sewer Operations group, and they oversee and enforce these requirements, are called the site and house connection permit. And that indeed follows the guidelines for the design and construction of stormwater management systems, which we published in July 2012, and you're all familiar following those requirements. So there are additional release rate requirements under the site connection and house connection rule per the 2012 stormwater rule, and the maximum discharge rate is often 0.25 CFS while the rainfall event is being managed. So this is where we are. And in the upcoming slides, what we would like to really focus on is how these two different requirements are going to be really unified under our new rule, which is currently published, and give you enough details that how much work that we have put together working with many of you over the years so that they are better aligned. So, you know, just to give you a brief highlights of what the unified rule is, indeed, our chapter 19.1 is going to be changing now, not only covering the separately storm sewer areas, but we are extending those requirements in the combined sewer system. So it's going to be one system for stormwater management. We are also lowering the threshold from the 1 acre, which only applies in the MS4, to a citywide 20,000 square foot or more soil disturbance, and adding the creation of 5,000 square foot. So those requirements are becoming smaller in terms of the soil disturbance, and the special coverage is extended from the separately sewered areas to the combined sewer areas. So the system is going to become one system for stormwater management. We are, by doing so, we are indeed adding much flexibility in the stormwater management design options, which you are going to see in the design manual, which we will walk you through. But also we are simplifying the rules and making them very much consistent across the city. So there's not much more interpretation of how the different rules apply, different parts of the city. So now the stormwater management is going to come under the unified rule. So with that being said, I think I'm going to pass it to Peg, and she's going to walk you through what is changing in the upcoming rule. So Peg, it's yours.
Thanks, Pinar. Okay, so in creating the unified rule, what we looked at first is what we had, and we had the MS4 rules, the separate storm sewer rules in chapter 19.1, which are primarily, the goal is water quality, improving the water quality in and around the water bodies in the city. And then we had chapter 31, which really focuses on the system that carries the water, whether it's the combined sewer system or the separate sewer system. It focuses on making sure that that system operates well. In trying to unify these rules, not only for our own convenience, but so that applicants coming to us with projects can benefit from that unification, we looked at how we could make this work better. So expanding the chapter 19.1 into the combined sewer service area means that we're going to be able to have another way to reduce the flows that are causing combined sewer overflows and thereby improve water quality. And we're also going to apply our site and house connections are going to use the same standards throughout the city. So now, instead of looking at where I am and what storm applies in this area and what year map I have to look for this site, now you're going to have a standard set of rules to use to size and create your sewer connections for your sewer connection certifications. And in doing that, we were able to create this overlap area of green infrastructure where we can get credit for one for another. And if we go to the next slide. So we've designed a new manual to help guide folks on exactly what you can do to get credit for both. So I'm designing one practice now, and I'm getting credit both for water quality in chapter 19.1 and for controlling my flow. So now I'm just designing, maybe it's one practice, maybe it's a system, maybe it's a group of practices, but I'm using them together instead of designing one thing for one part of the agency and one thing for the other part of the agency. So that overlap, I think, is really going to improve things for all of us, make it simpler, more direct. Next slide. Thank you. Okay. So when we look at what's changing and how to get credit for for both rules, we are we're looking to see what you have to do. Well, what you have to do is sort of the same thing as it was previously. So you still have to create the stormwater pollution prevention plan to cover chapter 19.1. You still have to submit that on the online stormwater permitting and tracking system. And that plan has to cover erosion sediment control. It has to cover water quality in terms of dealing with the water quality volume and making sure that we're capturing and treating an appropriate volume. Runoff reduction means we're actually reducing and requiring the reduction of runoff on all sites now. And no net increase means that we're making sure that in certain water bodies are receiving flow, that we're addressing pollutants for that water body. Additionally, for the site and house connection proposals, when they apply, when you prepare that permit, you're still preparing that application, submitting it to BWSO in the same way that you've always done. But again, the goal is to manage the runoff and to control the volume leaving and the flow that's leaving the site. And that's what's changing, is how much flow you're allowed to leave the site. Next, please. So in looking at when don't I need to get a permit, if you're sponsoring a project in the city and it's in an MS4 area, a separate sewer area, and DEC, the New York State Department of Environmental Protection, Conservation, has issued, it's giving you coverage under the general permit before June 1st of 2019. That's when the first round, Chapter 19, became effective for the first time. If you have that letter of acknowledgement already, you don't need to get coverage under this part of the program, under Chapter 19.1. If DEP has issued an MS4 SWIP acceptance already within the last 2 years from the date that is going to be the effective date of the Unified Stormwater Rule, again, you would not be required to get new coverage, but just be careful. It's within 2 years of the effective date. If you have an older approval, and there are just a few out there, those approvals do expire in 2 years. So make sure that you're on top of that. And if you need to get an extension on that approval, you do that. Additionally, as of March 26, 2021, that is a correct date. As of March 26, 2021, any project that disturbed 1 or more acres in either the combined sewer service area or the MS4 area is required to get a permit under Chapter 19.1. So if you applied to DOB or SBS for construction document approval before 3/26/21, and you can document that, then you would not be required to get coverage or to get a permit under Chapter 19.1. And additionally, as we move into the actual unified rule for MS4 and CSS projects that may be smaller than 1 acre, if they are not located in a rezoned area, and you can demonstrate that you've applied to DOB or SBS for construction document approval before the effective date, you will not be required to comply with the permitting. However, again, if you're located in a rezoned area and developing the site pursuant to that rezoning, to the recent rezoning, then DOB or SBS issued permit for construction must have been issued before December 10th, which is the date of publication of the rule. And in that case, you would not be required to comply with these rules. So it's a little bit simpler for Chapter 31. If you already have a site that has a site connection certification already, then you're good to go, except it doesn't apply to a site located in a rezoned area that is developing pursuant to that rezoning. And the part of the reasoning for that, if I can get the next slide, is that for rezoned areas, you're going to be required to do a hydrology and hydraulics analysis prior to getting an approval for a new site connection. And the hydrology and hydraulics analysis is required because once you get that, most rezonings are done, they increase density and use in the area that is rezoned. And because of that, that puts a great strain on the system, on the operating system, the pipes in the ground. So before the site connections are allowed to begin to be made, you need to analyze that and see if the in-ground sewers can handle those flows. If they can't handle those flows, something needs to be done about it. So in some way, that system's got to be upgraded before any site connection certifications would be given. Next slide, please. So chapter 19.1 addresses water quality through the requirements for a stormwater pollution prevention plan. We also call that a SWIP. And that leads to a stormwater construction permit. We've developed all in the original stormwater design manual for the MS4 system. We developed a number of flow charts that made it very simple for anyone to figure out, do I need to get this permit or don't I need to get this approval and this permit? And we've done that again and added those into the manual. So you see that these figure and this table are for chapter 19.1, and they very clearly direct you that, does my project disturb more than 20,000 square feet? If it doesn't, but I'm still, does it make 5,000 square feet of new impervious area? Remember, impervious area is critical to water quality. When we pave over the ground, it increases the flow running off the site and also increases all the dirt that comes and runs off with it. So do I create 5,000 square feet of impervious area where it was pervious before? If you do, then you're subject to those requirements under chapter 19.1. And to help, and it tells you, okay, now you should look, is my development activity listed in table 2.2 or 2.3? And table 2.2 tells you activities that require erosion sediment control during construction only. Table 2.3 gives you a list of activities that require erosion sediment control and post-construction stormwater management, which would later require you to also get a stormwater maintenance permit. Next slide, please. Thank you. It also guides you through this, the same idea. You can see it's a little bit more straightforward for site connection, but it's the same idea. The project proposes a new site connection, yes or no. DOP requires a house or site connection, yes or no. And it gets you into the area, and then it takes you to the next step, to step 3. And each flow diagram goes into the next one so that it's a logical way for you to discern and decide, are we required to get a permit under chapter 19.1 and or a site connection certification? So additionally, flow diagram 3 says, okay, here's all the parts of the report and the places in the manual where I can figure out what I need to include in my application and how does that application submittal happen. And again, that flow diagram number 3 is another one that's included in the manual that's going to be a lot of help to you and help you figure out what you're doing. Next slide, please. So to me, this is one of the most interesting slides because it shows you the parallel processes. So the stormwater construction permit and the site house connection permit and approval process. Which one do I have to get first is the question I've heard more often than any other at this point. And the answer is, well, which one you apply for first is really up to you. But no matter which you apply for first, before you can get a stormwater construction permit, which means before you can actually start construction on a site, put a shovel in the ground, you need both your site connection proposal certification and your SWIP approval or your SWIP acceptance, which is essentially the same thing. And you need both of those in place before you can apply or to get your stormwater construction permit. Once you get your stormwater construction permit, then you may begin construction. And near the end of construction, somewhere near the end of construction, usually folks go and they apply to the borough office to actually pull their site connection permit. The site connection permit gets pulled, they check the connection, they make sure everything is good, they give you your permit, and then, only then, when you have that in hand, can you apply for your notice of termination to close your stormwater construction permit. And if you're required to do post-construction practices, you'd also be required at this point to apply for your stormwater maintenance permit. So that would happen at this point in the process. Okay, thank you. And just to give you an idea of how complex this can be, this particular flow diagram, which is one of the more complex ones we have in the manual, it's still there. This shows you the overlap between DEP's Chapter 19.1 permitting process and DEC's notice of intent requirements. Now, when you look at this slide, everything that has that sort of gray bubbly shading on it requires a signature from DEP, from the city, before you can go to DEC and get something done. So the first one is right in the upper right-hand corner there. It says applicant submits DEP signed SWIP acceptance form. And this looks a little bit different than it used to. No longer using the state permit. And if you've gotten an approval recently, you've probably seen the new format. But this is going to be just as good as the old state MS4 SWIP acceptance. So if you're doing something in the separately sewered area, you still have to go to DEC. You still have to apply. You still have to get the NOI and get coverage under the SPD's general permit for construction activities. And you go through that whole process. And before you can close that process, you need an NOT that has been signed by DEP. And it says that your site is reached final stabilization, and that either closes the permit or that your site's reached final stabilization and you've applied for coverage under a stormwater maintenance permit or for a stormwater maintenance permit from New York City DEP. Okay, now Melissa Enoch from our GI Planning and Partnerships is going to take us through the new manual, which is very exciting.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Peg. So if you enjoyed those flowcharts that Peg showed on her slides, then you'll like our new New York City Stormwater Manual. It is very visual and graphic, and one of the things we really strived to do with this new Unified Stormwater Rule was convey first and foremost what we mean by retention first, or green infrastructure, or things that we are anticipating the design community to integrate into their projects. And we took some lessons learned from some other cities across the nation who have very similar stormwater regulations. And in fact, our model approach, or our manual approach, is based very closely off of the City of LA's stormwater manual, in that they have approached it from a function based category first. So we'll go over that in a minute. But the manual has 6 chapters. Chapter 1 is an introduction chapter, very basic, tells you what's in the manual. Chapter 2 is a very important chapter. It covers the stormwater management requirements. It points back to the rules that you can view in draft form today, and explicitly tells you what is included in these regulatory requirements from both Chapter 19.1 and Chapter 31. Chapter 3 covers the city development and review requirements. So what this chapter is going to do is show you that workflow flow chart that Peg went over, that shows how both Chapter 19.1 and 31 permits get reviewed and approved. It's going to cover the entire process from submission to closeout for Chapter 19.1 permits. For those of you who have projects that will trigger Chapter 31, you're going to continue to use the guidance and application materials that are available on DEP's website, though those are being updated right now for the rollout of this new rule. So then Chapter 4 is the heart of the manual. If you can just go back, thank you. Chapter 4 is the heart of the manual. It covers the stormwater management practice selection and design. This is the longest part of the manual, and it has all the formulas you need and is very critical to successful projects. And then Chapter 5 covers your post-construction stormwater management requirements. So if you trigger Chapter 19.1 stormwater construction permit and you also require a stormwater maintenance permit, you're going to get that information that you need for that maintenance permit in Chapter 5. And then lastly, we have a chapter dedicated to right-of-way stormwater management requirements. So there's a subset of covered development activity that is going to trigger Chapter 19.1 requirements. So we created a dedicated kind of mini manual just for those projects that goes step by step through design and maintenance requirements and so forth. So we'll go now right into Chapter 4. So I mentioned that we took the approach for this manual to convey our guidance based on stormwater management practice function. And we'll get into why that's really important on the next slide, but I want to go over the definition of our stormwater management practice functions quickly so that you all can think about this as we cover the next few slides. So when we're talking about an infiltration practice, we're talking about a practice where stormwater runoff is captured and it's infiltrated into the underlying soils. This obviously requires sufficient permeability rates. And when we're talking about infiltration, we're talking about practices that do not use under drains or outlet pipes, as we refer to them here, to drain the system. So a classic example of an infiltration practice is a bioretention practice. And if you're familiar with the New York City Green Infrastructure Program and our right-of-way rain gardens, then that is the classic example. Those rain gardens have no under drains or outlet pipes. They are infiltrating the soil, infiltrating the stormwater runoff into the soils below. The next practice is a filtration practice. This differs from an infiltration practice in that it does rely upon an outlet pipe to help drain the practice. So stormwater runoff is going through a filtration media. It helps to remove the various pollutants. And a classic example for those of you who are familiar with working within MS4 areas is a sand filter. Evapotranspiration practices, water is captured and evaporated back into the atmosphere. This relies on some form of evapotranspiration happening between rainfall events so that practice is drained and ready for the next event. The classic example here is a green roof. Detention, pretty straightforward. And those of you who are very familiar with the Chapter 31 requirements for sewer operations, you're doing plenty of these practices. Water is temporarily stored and released at a lower flow rate. This relies on the ability to control the rate of flow of stormwater leaving the practices. So they usually have a controlled flow device, such as an orifice. And the classic example here is a detention tank. And then the very last one, and not least, is stormwater reuse. So here, water is captured and reused for non-irrigation purposes. This practice relies on a continuous reuse of water, and the practices can be integrated into existing non-potable or non-contact water uses. So we do categorize this as retention in this particular example. And because the stormwater is being completely removed from the sewer system because it's relying on that continuous reuse. And a classic example here is reuse in a cooling tower. So next slide. So one of the reasons why we chose this function forward framework was that it allows designers maximum flexibility for selecting a few practices, but configuring them differently depending on the unique considerations of each site. So you can have one practice that can function different ways depending on how you design it. So the classic example, and the one we've included here on the right, is a stormwater planter. So the image on the top of the screen is showing a stormwater planter designed as an infiltration practice, where you see the various vegetation and media components and stormwater being infiltrated directly into the soils below it. So obviously, to be used on a site, this site would require good permeability rates in the soil. Below it, we have the same stormwater planter being designed as a filtration device, where you have an outlet pipe that is configured into the system and is allowing stormwater to be drained from the practice through that outlet pipe and back to the sewer. So you have some stormwater pollutants being removed through the various media components, but this is indeed a filtration device, not an infiltration practice. So because we have this functional framework, this means that a lot of the guidance we're providing to you varies based on the function of each system. So we have hierarchies that show you guidance for retention versus treatment versus detention practices. We have sizing guidance, which is going to show you a lot of specific formulas for calculating your practice size so that you can achieve your various requirements. And then we have design criteria that varies based on your infiltration rate of your soils or the media depth that you're using. And then, as I've mentioned before, guidance that's specified and changes based on the components you're using. So whether you have outlet pipes or no outlet pipes. So hopefully you've seen these hierarchies before. We've been showing them at workshops for the last 2.5 years. This is the MS4 area hierarchy. We have another one on the next slide for the combined sewer. But the way you read these should be pretty straightforward. They are read from left to right, top to bottom, and the dark boxes are the higher tiers, and then the lower tiers are the light blue. So you can also see our goals and the arrows at the top and to the left. So at the top, you'll see that our primary goal for this hierarchy and the next one is retention. And then the secondary goal, which is also the same in both hierarchies, is vegetation. So we're prioritizing vegetated retention practices in citywide in both combined sewer and MS4 areas. Over to the right, you see an orange box that has stormwater reuse listed. And this is over to the right because it's anytime optional. So I mentioned before that we consider stormwater reuse systems with continuous use to be retention-based practices. And we are prioritizing retention, but reuse is a really good tool in our city. And so we consider that to be anytime optional. So that's why it's hanging out over on the side. So the other highlights, I won't go through all the practices because these are pretty straightforward, but the other highlights here are that as you move from the top of the hierarchy to the bottom, you'll see that we're going from vegetated retention to non-vegetated treatment. So if you rule out your top two tiers, the practices you're left with are practices that provide treatment. So stormwater pollutant reduction, but they do not have vegetation. And then to get to the bottom of that hierarchy, you have some specific constraints you have to demonstrate. So the next slide is the combined sewer area hierarchy. I won't go through this. The only difference here is that as you get to the bottom of your hierarchy, so here in tier 3, you have non-vegetated detention, so not treatment. Treatment is important for separately sewered areas because we're looking at water quality, volume, and pollutant reduction. And then in the combined sewer areas, we're really looking to capture the quantity of the stormwater runoff, and that helps us with reducing combined sewer overflows. So you'll see that your bottom hierarchy here includes non-vegetated detention practices like blue roofs and detention tanks and so forth. And you'll also note that Again, reuse systems, we consider those to be retention tools, very critical for our city, and they are anytime optional. All right, so I mentioned on the previous slides with the hierarchies that there are constraints that you as designers need to demonstrate as you move down the hierarchies from preferred tiers to lower tiers. And so what we did was create this checklist, and it's in the manual. I know the text is kind of small here, but it's more, it's easier to be read in the manual. But basically what we wanted to do was to show you practices by their tier and their function type, and what kinds of constraints might be acceptable that limit their feasibility for implementation. So you'll see, for example, that we have 5 categories of constraints. We have soil constraints. That means that you have infiltration rates less than ½ an inch per hour, which would limit the use of infiltration practices. We have subsurface constraints that could indicate that there is groundwater, high groundwater or high bedrock, which also limits the use of infiltration practices. You could have hotspot constraints. Those of you familiar with the state stormwater manual, we took the hotspot demonstration language straight from that manual. But basically, you know, hotspots could limit the use of infiltration practices, especially those without liners. And then we have very specific requirements for demonstrating your constraints for that. There could also be surface constraints. That could be something like regulations for parking and or egress requirements. These could limit the use of surface vegetated practices like bioretention in a parking lot. And then there are also space constraints that could exist. So there could be required setbacks from structures or utilities or Department of Buildings code for where you can infiltrate. And that could also limit the use of practices at the ground level. So we've not only listed in this checklist which practices might have that type of constraint, but we've also provided you with our general siting criteria for green infrastructure that we've developed through our green infrastructure program, which pulls together specific code requirements and setback requirements for implementing infiltration practices. So that's a good resource that we've tried to include here. So then as you go through your checklist, you'll see where we think it's acceptable to demonstrate one of these constraints, which each of these practices. Okay, so last slide, I think on chapter 4. Again, chapter 4 is really the heart of this design manual. We have set it up to be extremely flexible in terms of choosing the practices that will meet the water quality volume or the VV or the runoff reduction requirements. But one thing to note is that you will find your sizing requirements in chapter 4. And so all of your practices have to be designed to store the amount of volume that's required for your particular stormwater management requirement. And one thing that we did, because we get asked this all the time in our green infrastructure program, is we provided all the formulas up front that are going to allow you to calculate how to size your practice. So this particular equation that we've listed is indeed the storage volume formula for a stormwater management practice. And so each of these other inputs, the VP, the VS, the VI, the VD, we have formulas for those too, but we just wanted to demonstrate in this one quick slide that we've provided you with the guidance to size your practices. And so you'll have the other formulas and you'll be able to calculate that. And then the table on the right is also very important because, as Peg said, the whole Unified Stormwater Rule framework really centers around this idea of being able to use 1 or 2 or 3 practices to meet all of your stormwater management requirements. So when we set out to do this merging of our stormwater regulations, we wanted to make it feasible for designers to get credit for a project designed, a practice designed to infiltrate 100% of the water quality volume and to get credit for that towards the runoff reduction volume and the VV requirements, the sewer operation requirements. So this table tells you exactly how much credit you get for each of the various practices and their function towards your other requirements. So it's a little table, but it has a lot of importance in our manual, and I encourage you to read this section very closely. So with that, I will turn it over to Gareth King, who is in our Bureau of Water and Sewer Operations, to go over some important manual appendices that we created.
Hi, everyone. Sorry. Good afternoon. My name is Gareth King. In addition to unifying the rules, we're trying to unify the guidance such that the review process for both Chapter 19 and Chapter 31 meeting the rules has consistency in applicability and in the review process as well. Part of that is by making a significant appendix to the manual with a lot of information in it. As noted earlier, the manual will take the place of a number of existing manuals and documents, and we're trying to fold in all of the previously separate guidance documents into one place. We're also adding new tools and spreadsheets that are going to be publicly available to the appendix to help with the design so that it'll be easier to meet our requirements earlier in the process. And so we can, because we want to make sure the review time is kept as low as possible. Each of the appendices can assist with the process of meeting requirements depending on which is applicable to a given project. And importantly, how the volumes provided can meet the stormwater construction permit rules, and how that, along with the Chapter 31 rules. The workflow should be straightforward to understand with explicit and simplified checklists, clear citing guidelines, and examples, many examples about what's acceptable for various types of sites that might need to be developed. So you can take an example and see if it's similar to one of the projects that you're proposing and just basically change some of the numbers around, and in many cases that it should work. The examples won't capture everything, but they capture a lot as long as the user of the appendix understands what's going on with the hydrology of the site. Within the appendix, we also have extensive information about the best practices for operations and maintenance of the facilities, as well as some detail about the design of practices that have to be built within the right-of-way, which occasionally comes up. Could I go to the next slide, please? We've also made public immediately our pump workbook and the specific requirements for this and for the inputs that we need, and are provided, as well as a short overview on how the process of iterating through to find the operating point is done. This just shows the workbook excels, but there's also an explainer about how to fill out the various pieces of information. The design process for meeting the requirements wasn't always clear compared to what a lot of applicants learn about pump design in school, because oftentimes one has to design a pump to discharge as quickly as possible, whereas we're trying to make sure that it doesn't exceed a specific number. We've also added additional functionality to beyond from our existing spreadsheet, and as I noted before, to where you can put in points on the pump curve and it can find the operation point automatically. And if anybody has spreadsheet number 3 for our existing Excel spreadsheets, we can't do that right now, but if you can copy over the information from your pump curve in some of the fields here, it basically figures out exactly how the pump will act based on the head losses. Could I go to the next slide, please? And so Melissa noted earlier that the crediting of various volumes towards each set of requirements is going to be much more explicit. And it's very important to reiterate this because we want to make sure that we're not penalizing people if they build a system which works really well to meet Chapter 19 requirements. We don't want to say we don't want to make sure that we don't want to say that they have to build another system as well to meet the Chapter 31 requirements. So as part of that, we have a workbook which will allow any applicant to figure out the volumes that they have to have for the different elements of a system in series. Now, you can use the workbook to figure out the volume requirement on your own without having anything in series, but we seem to think that it's the systems in series are going to become more like commonplace because of the nature of the rule in the future. And the formulas that are used and embedded here are the same as what was listed in chapter 31 and in the workbook. But a lot of the work has been automated out of it. So we're going to use the same workbook in our review. So we should have, it should make it faster to get things certified. And so this should reduce the number of resubmissions, and it should reduce the review time for all of the applications, which is important because we don't want to increase it from what it is now. That's it.
Thank you, Gareth. Thank you, Peg and Melissa and Pinar. I know that we went through a lot of content and a lot of technical details, but before we close out, we do want to talk you through the next steps and what you can anticipate during this public comment time for the rule. So I'm sure all of you saw that the amended rules went live on the city record on December 10th. And of course, we have today's informational briefing. We've scheduled a second one on January 4th, but I should note that today's recording, as well as a PDF of the slides that were shared today, will be available on the DEP website by tomorrow. And we will circulate the presentation, the recording, and all of the links that are listed here on resources to everyone that registered for today's meeting. So we want to make all of this material as accessible to you as quickly as possible, so that you have time to review and to ask questions before the formal public hearing, which will be held on January 10th at 11 a.m. Via Microsoft Teams, and we'll circulate that link to you as well. But given the fact that it is the holiday season, the new year, we understand that there is a lot going on for folks right now. We want to make sure that we're being responsive to questions as they come in. So during the meeting, we're seeing that some of you are putting questions in through the chat and through the Q&A. We will make sure to document these questions and to respond to them in writing on our website via a frequently asked question document. And so as we go through the next several weeks, we'll continue to update that document so that we can be responsive to questions as they come in, and that everyone that's reviewing the rule, reviewing the manual, can review our responses at the same time. If you haven't visited our website yet, I strongly encourage you to do so, because we've made all of these materials available to you. There's an overview of the Unified Stormwater Rule. You can link from our website to the city record to see the amendments for Chapter 31 as well as Chapter 19.1. But I encourage you to use the DEP website to review the NYC Stormwater Manual that Melissa and Gareth walked us through. The links on the DEP website have all of the workbooks and appendices called out, and so they're a little bit easier to review than on the city records website. But you should be able to easily navigate between both. And again, we encourage you to send us your questions via the New York City rules at dep.nyc.gov email address. So any comments or questions from today's presentation or that you come across as you're reviewing the documents, you're welcome to submit those to nycrules@dep.nyc.gov. And again, the questions that we receive to that email address, as well as the questions that have come in during today's public meeting and the public meeting on the 4th, will be added to our frequently asked questions document, which will be updated on the DEP website. And we'll continue to send out those links and to make sure that all of those resources are available to you. And so with that, I'm going to close this afternoon's meeting. Actually, I'll stick around for a couple more minutes just in case folks want to send questions into the chat or the Q&A. But if not, I will say thank you. Have a good evening. Please be safe. And we look forward to hearing your comments and your questions as you review the materials. So thank you so much, everyone, and have a great rest of the evening.